My name is Evelyn Cartwright, and I turned 69 this spring. I used to draw gardens for a living, walk a piece of land, listen to its wind, and sketch where light wanted to fall. Graham, my late husband, called it my superstition. I called it my work. Together we shaped Larkspur Hall, an old field rolled into terraces, brick paths, and a house that sits long and low the way a heron rests on water. He chose the bones. I grew the skin. The tile in the foyer is our argument made permanent, his clean geometry, my scatter of floral inlays. We were not wealthy when we started. We bought this acreage with a plan and a willingness to be tired for a decade. 1 week before my son's wedding, the house hummed with unfamiliar footsteps. Stylists dragging garment bags, florists threading wire through arches, a planner tapping on a tablet, as if the rocks themselves had RSVP'd. The property had been appraised last winter at $4.2 million. A number that felt clinical, like being told the weight of a heartbeat. I carried a pitcher of lemonade out to the patio, an old reflex from when Julian and the neighborhood boys skinned their knees on the flagstones. The air smelled of wet fern and ribbon glue. A girl in a headset 19 maybe stepped in front of me with the courage of someone sent on an errand. "Ma'am," she said, each syllable dressed in apology, the bride asked, "that family keep to the main house today?" "Closer to..." "Well, the actual family." Something thin cracked behind my sternum. Not a shatter, a hairline fracture whose echo I knew would travel later. I looked past the girl. Julian stood by the pergola, fastening a cufflink, the same careless tilt aimed to his head he had at 6 whenever he lied about brushing his teeth. He saw me see him. He lowered his gaze to the gravel as if a stone had become urgent. Sienna Vale arrived, carrying a clipboard like a scepter. She had the efficient beauty of a magazine-spread silk jumpsuit, pale manicure mouth that pleased the camera before it pleased the person across from it. Instead of hello, she gave me a thoughtful smile, the kind you keep in your pocket for retail counters. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said, "the greatest gift you could give us is privacy this week. We want the space to feel like ours." The word ours walked straight through me. I held the picture 2 seconds longer than polite and set it down. "A reminder," I said quietly. "This hall you're styling," I gestured at the eaves, the terrace, the windows that mirror the meadow, "is legally mine." The girl in the headset shifted her weight. Sienna's smile didn't budge. It brightened as if someone had asked for a bigger number on the sign. Inside, I found picture hooks standing empty along the upstairs corridor. Frames had been moved to a closet, their glass faces turned away like embarrassed guests. The gate code on the mudroom door asked for a number it had never asked of me. In small increments, a person can be moved from the center of her own life to its hallway and then finally to the stoop. The body notices even when the mind is still writing invitations. Larkspur Hall was not always crowded. When we first bought the land, it was coarse grass and stubborn stones. We were 40-something and too hopeful, which might be the only clean way to be foolish. Graham dug irrigation by hand that first month, mapping the lines with string. We planted larkspur where the ground kept its chill and espaliered pears against the southern wall so they would wear the sun. When Julian was born, we put in a run of redbud trees. In April, they stitched the property with pink and the bees came like a blessing. When Graham died pancreatic cancer, a thief that doesn't bother to be stealthy, the house learned to hold its breath with me. I stayed. The work of staying can be a life. People forget that. I learned the weight of mulch bags, the timing of frost, the precise sag in the back steps that told me a board would need replacing. It was not joy every day, but it was something more reliable. Julian visited often at first. He brought soup when I got the winter flu, stood on a ladder to paint the shutters the sober blue his father had loved, sent photos of the municipal library he was helping renovate. He spoke about turning the carriage house into a studio one day. Home talk. Then came Sienna, a woman with straightforward cheekbones and eyes that counted. She liked the grounds, which she called quaint, the way someone might compliment an heirloom they do not want. At dinner, she steered conversation toward resorts, influencers, and the correct overhead lighting for a proposal. When I asked about her family, she offered sentences that parked neatly and did not invite questions to pull in beside them. What changes in a person begins as a shrug. Julian declined a Sunday meal because of a quick call, then another because of planning. Then because we should talk about you downsizing so you can travel, Mom, you have earned it. Ideas arrive with a beneficent bow when they intend to remove you without a mess. I heard Sienna's cadence in his sentences, the way a melody lingers even after you've left the room where it was playing. 2 months before the wedding, Julian came by with a manila envelope and that bright, brittle optimism of a son who needs help and wants to sound as if he is helping you. "Insurance stuff for the venue," he said. "The planner needs proof of ownership. It's just easier if we put Sienna's name on the event forms. Temporary, I promise." Temporary is a word that can be stretched to cover most trespasses. I read the first page, then the third, then the seventh, which repeated the first more legally. I asked more than once why anything about Larkspur Hall needed anyone's name besides mine. "Mom," he said, leaning in like a television host, softening the hard sell. "This is standard. Don't make it a thing." His smile said he was tired. The pages smelled faintly of toner and hand cream. I signed. Things shifted almost imperceptibly after that. Sienna gave instructions to the grounds crew, then apologized for overstepping while handing a list for next week. A new dining table arrived because the old one didn't suit the rehearsal aesthetic. My key for the side door became a small ornament that fit nothing. The morning I stood outside the front gate with 2 sacks of feed for the hens and no code that would open the iron, I phoned Julian. He paused for a long moment and then told me the security company had updated the system. "It's not about you," he said. "The gardener Mateo mentioned to me in a careful voice that he'd heard the estate referred to as their wedding gift. He didn't know whose gift to whom, only that caterers took notes when Sienna spoke. I thanked him and watered the ferns a second time, though they did not need it. 3 days before the ceremony, there was a dinner planned for her relatives who had flown in from a coast where the sun feels like a performance. I set a platter of peppers on the counter, nothing fancy the way food takes the temperature of a kitchen when people are at ease in it. Julian found me near the front hall, his expression rehearsed. "Sienna's family is exhausted," he said. "Maybe it's better if you take the night to yourself." That sentence was a final draft. It had traveled through edits before landing in my ear. I had been the parent who rubbed Vicks on his chest during croup, the person he once asked to examine the monstrous bravery of a worm he'd found. Now I was a possible disturbance to napkins. I carried my plate to the back steps and ate outside with the moths. Through the dining room glass, I watched candles throw polite halos over faces I barely knew. Sienna lifted her flute of champagne and met my eyes without flinching. Her smile did not warm, it assessed. Later, I found a suitcase on the bed in the small guest room at the end of the corridor, the one with the vent that only pretends to heat. My belongings had been folded neatly, the way you pack a person you do not quite wish to anger. On the desk lay a card with the ceremony program. My name was absent from where mothers are supposed to be. It should not have surprised me yet. My hand went to the edge of the desk to steady itself, as if a wave had moved through the floorboards. I do not keep passwords in my head. I keep them in paper, and I keep paper where paper belongs. Graham had always teased me for my tidy ruin tidy, because I labeled everything ruin because I labeled too much. But there was one thing he filed without my help, a habit from his years in contract law, a black binder hidden on the lowest shelf behind a row of heavy atlases. He called it our rainy day book and told me with a grin that tried to be light that I should only open it if the clouds refused to lift. I took a small lamp into the library and knelt. The atlases gave in with a sigh. The binder had dust on its spine but none on its clasp. Inside were copies of the deed to Larkspur Hall documents describing our trust and notes in Graham's hands, small and decisive, as if the pen did the thinking. A letter on thin paper waited under the first sleeve. "Eve," it began. Only he called me that. "If you are reading this, it means the ordinary guardrails failed. The house is yours, not in sentiment, in law. A transfer cannot occur without your notarized signature independently witnessed. If anyone tells you otherwise, call Rowan Hale." I read the paragraph 3 times, not because I believed it less each time, but because belief needed company. I dialed the number printed after the name. Rowan answered with the courteous caution of a man who has learned to expect emergencies from unknown callers. When I said my own name, something softened in his voice. He had shared red wine at my kitchen table after Graham's funeral, a night when we talked about risk and raspberry canes for too long, because grief requires detours. "Read me the clause," he said. I did, steadying myself on syllables that have never been hospitable to me, encumbrance, transferability, attestation. There was a pocket of silence on the line, the kind that is not empty but exact. "Evelyn," he said finally, "your husband tightened every screw. You are the sole owner. Nothing moves without you." The windows were open. From the meadow, the frogs spoke their plain declaration of evening. I set the phone down, opened the binder again, and photographed every page with the slow care of a person who has learned how expensive it is to misplace things. The lamp, too bright a moment earlier, felt tempered now, as if light had learned the room. I slid the letter back where it belonged, closed the cover, and replaced the atlases one by one. The house does not change when you are certain. It simply returns to you the space your uncertainty had been renting. I stood in the doorway of the library and traced in my mind the geometry of the terrace, how Graham insisted on a longer step there to match the stride he said joy takes. The lemon tree in the conservatory had set new fruit. A moth pressed itself to the screen, fragile and stubborn. I switched off the lamp. I did not raise my voice. I did not draft an email. I did not rehearse what I would say if anyone pushed harder. I did one thing, only I knew exactly where I stood. I slept without dreams and woke before the birds. The library still smelled of dust and linen thread from the binder's spine. A pearly gray slipped over the conservatory glass. The lemon tree leaves looked newly lacquered. Knowing where I stood did not make the house different. It made my posture different inside it. I boiled water, set a pot of oats on low, and spread the binder's copies across the kitchen table. One by one, I slipped them into thick plastic sleeves, labeled them with a sensible hand, Deed Cartwright, Larkspur Hall, Trust Cartwright. Family additional clauses. I carried a set to the safe behind the pantry shelf and slid another into the weatherproof pouch I once used for seed packets. The third I tucked beneath the cushion of the chaise in the sewing room, a place no one visits unless they intend to mend. By 9, the property had woken to the agenda of strangers. Trucks murmured in the lane. A giddy voice on speakerphone practiced saying Champagne Tower as if it were a difficult prayer. My phone lit with an email from Sienna, a palette guide for mother's attire, a request that I choose quiet tones that recede, and a note reminding household members to avoid kitchen use during service hours. A second email from an address with a stylized ampersand veil and veil arrived with attachments labeled Vendor Access Authorization. The forms left a rectangle for a signature that was not mine. I brewed tea instead of responding. When the kettle clicked off, I carried my cup into the mudroom. The keypad had learned a number I had not. I reached for the control panel beneath the stairs, the one Graham installed when he decided light should be as obedient as water, and typed the master code I had never told anyone. Networks reintroduced themselves: exterior gates, carriage house, door, service gate, by the orchard. I reset the guest credentials, not a flourish, a correction. In the rose garden, Mateo arrived early, shoulders dotted with dew, a spool of tie tape in his back pocket. He has tended our beds for 12 years and never once touched a flower with impatience. Signora Evelyn, he said, lifting his cap. Walk with me, I answered. We followed the pea gravel path past the pergola. The sky held to its quiet. I told him plainly that the house was mine by deed and clause, and that any permission for use began and ended with me. I asked him to let the irrigation sleep on the morning of the ceremony, to stand down the lighting conduit he'd been asked to lay for the lawn, to remove the portable power boxes from the hedge line before dusk the night prior. He listened without blinking, as if I were telling him about fungal rust. Claro, he said, if there is pushback, you will not be alone, I said. There are documents. I did not lift my hand to the sky when I said it. I simply rested it on the top rail of the fence and felt the grain under my palm. He nodded and reached down to pinch a sickly bud from a hybrid tea that never learned to be sensible. Back in the kitchen, I set a pot to simmer onions the color of straw lentils, a branch of rosemary. The scent stitched itself into the house. I could hear the wedding planner in the entry hall explaining to someone that the stairway needed a more editorial line, which I think meant she wanted less of it. She was still instructing a team about ribbon when Sienna stepped into the doorway. Didn't expect to find you cooking, she said, as if she'd walked into a conservation exhibit where the animals had wandered from their text panels. I live here, I said. The stove understands me. Her smile was careful. This week is delicate. For the caterers to stage properly, the kitchen should remain neutral. Neutral, I repeated, tasting the word and finding it starch thin. My mother avoids garlic before big events, she added, as if citing a medical journal. My mother ate garlic when she was happy, I said. It improved everything. The simmering pot made a domestic song of itself. Sienna's attention cut around the room at the open shelving, the blue crock of wooden spoons, the coil of copper whisk, then returned to me with a look that was either admiration or inventory. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse. I'll tell the team to work around you, she said, and left. By afternoon, the mood of the house changed. It was not a mood I recognized. An acrylic table appeared beneath the front windows with a seating chart that looked like the schematic for a minor airport. A crate of pressed linen arrived, each napkin sheathed in plastic the way butchers wrap careful cuts. A man in black moved a walnut bench from the east lawn and placed a folding prop where it had stood for 15 summers. I lifted the bench with one end, he with the other, and together we returned it to shade. Sorry, he said, I just do what they tell me. So did I once I said until I read the instructions. At dusk, Julian found me in the foyer where I had set a vase of mock orange from the north hedge. He had shaved too close. The nick at his jawline looked like a small, embarrassed mouth. We've been talking, he said, which meant Sienna had spoken and he had listened. Mom, maybe it's easier for everyone if you stay elsewhere through Sunday. It'll keep the energy clean. Clean, I said, as if we were discussing grout. I'll book a room at the inn near the lake, he added quickly, hopeful courtesy in his voice, and we'll send you the photos right after. I set the vase on the foyer table and squared its base with the grain. I looked at my son's face and saw both the boy who once fell asleep on my shoulder and the man who believed that absence could be purchased. If I leave, I said, plain as weather, the house leaves. He blinked. What? Larkspur Hall does not host an event without its owner present. The use agreements require it. Vendors under contract with me will honor that. He stared, then tried on dismissal as if it were an overcoat he was not sure would fit. We've paid deposits, he said. I know who wrote the checks, I answered. I recognized my own hand. He looked suddenly unsteadily young. She'll be furious, he whispered in admission meant for me and for himself. That's a matter for the people who promised her control they did not own, I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, and dragged his palm over his jaw as if to erase the nick. He turned away, then looked back as if a refrain had returned to a song he didn't like. You've changed, he said. No, I said not unkindly. You've grown used to me stepping aside. Night laid a thin sheen over the lawn. Out back past the orchard, frogs spoke out of sequence. I set a small bag in the trunk of the car, thermos sweater, a book of essays I have never finished, and drove down the curved drive, parking just outside the iron gate beneath the old beach. The house threw a theater of light behind me. Crews untied lengths of fabric and knotted them again. Laughter chimed in bright tin rounds. I lowered the seat, opened the window 2 inches, and listened to wind-fine leaves. I woke with first light. Dew had stitched a fine lace over the boxwood. On the hood of the car, it laced itself again. I stretched carefully so the old ache in my hip did not complain. Then I carried the galvanized watering can from the trunk to the roses by the gate and filled it at the spigot. The water's arc was the sound of a good decision landing without fanfare. 7 o'clock brought a convoy, a panel van with a logo in pale gold, a box truck stacked with crates of glassware, a small bus that smelled of hairspray and laughter, and a utility pickup with extension cords coiled like sleeping snakes. They idled in confusion at the base of the drive. A boy in a black polo walked to the call box and frowned at the keypad. Another tried the service gate and peered down the fence line as if a hidden entrance might declare itself out of pity. I tipped the watering can and watched the water disappear into the root line. The lilies beside the roses lifted their faces as if someone had told a joke they understood. A man with a headset. The kind of headset that makes a person feel deputized strode toward me. Ma'am, he said, we're here for the Vale Cartwright wedding. The gates aren't responding. They will respond to the correct code, I said. Can you buzz us in? He glanced at the houses beyond the hedgerow as if a neighbor might lean over and grant permission that would simplify the morning. Who did you contract with, I asked. He named a company I did not recognize, then another. Then he said, and Mrs. Vale, the owner's authorization, please. He held out a printed sheet. At the bottom, an elegant flourish pretended to be mine. That, I said, belongs in a shredder. He flushed the way boys do when the rules they've memorized fail them. I'll call the planner, he said, and retreated. By 20 past, the drive had become a stalled parade. Phones lifted to ears. Voices traveled the length of the convoy and back. A woman with a makeup kit the size of a carry-on attempted the gate code 4 times with improved confidence and no success. An electrician in a tidy gray shirt popped the lid on a junction box near the service entrance and then closed it again with a gentle, chastened click. Light is honest when the power belongs to it. Sienna appeared a few minutes later, heels fast, jaw set. Her hair was lifted into the kind of calm an army requires. She stopped when she saw me near the gate, the watering can at my feet, the roses damp and reluctant to be beautiful. Evelyn, she said, trimmed of charm. Good morning, I answered. It's fine weather. There's a problem with access, she said, as if I had not noticed the choir of idle engines. The access works perfectly, I said. It knows precisely who belongs. Her nostrils made a delicate assessment of my sentence. This isn't the graciousness we discussed. We did not discuss graciousness, I said. We discussed ownership. You were told to build an event that included the house's owner. You omitted that element. She glanced at the caravan and then back at me, calibrating. You can't do this, she said, but the sentence wobbled. I cut a spent bloom from the rose nearest the post and let it fall to the gravel. You've mistaken my quiet for assent, I said. That is all. As if cued, a young runner from the lighting company trotted up with bad news. The extension power routed along the hedges wasn't live. No one could find the permissions for the lawn spikes. The sprinkler schedule had reappeared in the system and would ruin the evening wiring if they turned it off without the master key. He looked from me to Sienna and back, weighing outcomes like a student with both hands full. Thank you, I told him. Please do not trespass. He nodded, relieved to have received any instruction that sounded like a complete sentence. The planner arrived finally, breathless, with an apology composed entirely of vowels. She wore a blazer the color of overwatered basil and carried a tablet that blinked. We have a timeline, she said, as if announcing latitude and longitude. What you have are expectations, I said. The house has requirements. They are different things. Her mouth formed a fast line. I could see in her face the arithmetic of penalties and reorder fees, the soft panic of chauffeurs waiting for instruction. She stepped aside to telephone someone whose name she said as if the syllables might help. Julian did not appear. That absence did not feel like vindication. It felt like weather passing a field it didn't know how to nourish. By 9, 3 trucks had turned around. By 10, the drive belonged again to birds and air. I carried the watering can back to the spigot and filled it once more. The water hissed and settled. In the distance, a fox slunk along the far fence, pretended not to watch me, and then did. I walked the terrace and nudged a lantern 2 fingers to the right so it would sit true. I returned the walnut bench to its older angle beneath the maple and reclaimed the patch of shade that belonged to reading. The acrylic seating chart stood alone on its borrowed legs, important to no one. I left it where it was. The sun would do what it wanted with it. Inside, I opened windows. The house inhaled and exhaled like an old musician collecting breath for a favorite song. In the kitchen, the pot of lentils had cooled and thickened. I ladled them into a bowl and ate standing up the way a person does when she is both hungry and busy without hurrying. On the counter, the copies of the documents lay as if they were just paper. The clock over the stove ticked in the small declarative way clocks do when no one is arguing with them. The day had edges again. I could see them. I could feel them hold. By late morning, the drive was empty again, the gravel pale and undisturbed as if a wind had licked it clean. I stacked the vendor envelopes on a blue and white saucer and slid them into my canvas bag. The car started with a dutiful cough. Town was 10 minutes away. I drove with the windows down, the smell of cut clover climbing into the car and sitting like a quiet passenger. Rowan Hale's office still occupied the second floor of the old bank building, its stair treads polished by a century of anxious shoes. His receptionist, a woman with a braid like a length of rope, waved me through. Rowan stood when I entered the way men do when they remember manners before they remember the reasons not to have them. "You look like yourself," he said. I remember how I answered and set the binder copies on his desk. He read quickly, pausing over the clause. Graham had insisted on no transfer without my notarized signature and independent witnesses, no use of the property for paid events in the owner's absence. He tapped a knuckle against the margin. "This is not theatrical," he said. "This is enforceable." We worked without flourish. He drafted a formal owner's notice of objection to unauthorized use and a revocation of access for vendors contracted through any party other than me. He attached copies of the deed and trust my identification and a short statement that the property would not host events unless the titled owner was physically present. He asked whether I wanted to seek a restraining order. "No," I said. "Paper will do." He nodded. "Paper often does." We sent certified notices to the planner's company, to the caterer, to the rental house, with the pretty name that specializes in pale gold forks, to the valet outfit that had been promised the circular drive, and to 2 coordinator firms whose logos had appeared on invoices I didn't recall approving. Rowan forwarded the same packet by email, then by courier. He printed a final copy for me and folded it into a manila envelope. "This is for your files," he said, which in Rowan's language meant, "This is ammunition you should not have to use but might need to hold." On my way home, I stopped at the post office for the certified receipts and at the bank to slide a duplicate set into the safe deposit box. The clerk at the window was the grandson of the woman who used to run the quilting guild. He called me Ms. Cartwright and asked about the lemon tree. People forget the world is stitched more securely than it looks. Larkspur Hall breathed when I opened the front door. That small interior exhale a house makes when a person who belongs to it steps through. A strip of late sun lay across the foyer rug. Down the hall, the acrylic seating chart stood where it had been abandoned, listing the names of strangers in a serif that took itself too seriously. I passed it and went to the library. From the garden came the easy arithmetic of birds. I poured water for tea and carried the cup to the trellis Graham had built as a dare to his own patience. Sienna's mother arrived by the side gate with a niece or a friend, someone young enough to be unafraid of judgment. They stepped into the garden as if it were an accessory you could put on wrong. "This light will flatten the complexion," the mother said, peering through her phone like a monocle. "We'll need reflectors." "You'll need shade," I said, not unkindly. By 3, the sun slides behind the sugar maples and the trellis turns to a silhouette. They started a little, then saw me. Sienna's mother arranged her mouth into courtesy. "We didn't realize that I am in my garden," and I finished. "The mistake is common lately." She glanced toward the house, measuring whether an apology would be useful. I let the silence sit until it felt like a chair she could choose to occupy or not. She did not. They backed out the side gate as if the grass were a lake and they preferred shore. Afternoon slipped into its late version. A handful of the groom's friends' boys who used to track mud into my kitchen wandered the lawn, moving chairs that had been borrowed long ago from the church basement for a neighborhood potluck and never properly returned. Someone hauled out a Bluetooth speaker. String quartets became playlists. Julian crossed the stone path carrying a stack of white napkins like a man transporting truce flags. We saw each other and did not speak. Inside, I opened the ledger Graham and I had kept for years, our neat compromise between art and arithmetic. Between its pages rested the schedule of assets for the Cartwright Family Trust and a restatement he had drafted and never needed to file while he was alive. Rowan had given me a clean copy earlier with yellow flags, where signatures should go. I sat at the desk Graham built out of walnut he could not afford when we were young and signed my name where the paper requested it. The nib caught once. I adjusted my hand and went on. I placed the documents into the outgoing tray and wrote Rowan's name on the top in a hand I recognized as my own. Music drifted. It wasn't strings. It was a curated kind of cheerfulness, upbeat without heat the way a resort smiles. Voices rose and fell a minister's rhythm or a friend's brave attempt. Applause came in polite squares as if measured in yards. I did not go to the window. I stood in the reading room and turned a page of a book I had put down 3 times already, because each time it felt as if it had been written for a woman who was no longer at my address. By evening, the yard had shed most of its strangers. A car door thudded. Laughter left in small knots. The lanterns the crew had abandoned earlier burned until the motion sensor reached the end of its patience and turned them off. Morning found me in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile and an unasked-for stillness. The phone rang at 8:14. The screen displayed a number I didn't know. Mrs. Cartwright, a voice said. "This is Talia from Greenfinch Events. We coordinated yesterday's ceremony at Larkspur." She inhaled as if someone had placed a glass of water just out of reach. "We received a packet last night from an attorney, Mr. Hale, stating that the titled owner objected to the event and that continued presence would constitute trespass. We were not aware." "You are aware now," I said. "Yes, ma'am." Paper rustled. "For clarity, you are the titled owner of Larkspur Hall." "I am." "We're reviewing the clauses your counsel sent," she said, voice thinning, particularly the requirement that the owner be physically present for any paid use. "We take these things seriously." "As do I." She paused. "Do you intend to pursue damages?" "No." I watched a bee nose the screen of the open window and then reconsider. "But I expect your company not to rebook with the parties who misrepresented authority here." "Yes, ma'am. We'll update our files." "Then we are finished," I said, and meant it. After the call, I took the watering can to the terrace and rinsed pollen from the stone. The house felt newly aired as if someone had opened a window in the past. 3 days later, the bell rang at 9. I knew who it would be. Some arrivals have a shape to them before they happen. Julian stood on the porch with Sienna and a man in a charcoal suit who carried a leather briefcase shaped to suggest verdicts. Julian's shoes were too polished for mourning. Sienna wore contrition the way an actor wears a coat in a scene set in winter. "Mom," Julian said, and then stopped because he had used the word mom and wasn't sure it still opened anything. "This is Mr. Dane," he gestured vaguely. "He's our attorney." "Are?" I asked. "Mine," Sienna said quickly. I stepped aside. "Come in." The sunroom receives daylight with the generosity of a chapel. We sat at the oak table Graham loved because it does not wobble even when people do. I set a glass of water in front of each of them and did not fuss. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Mr. Dane began, "which is how a lawyer says we are losing ground we thought was stable. My clients believe there was a pending transfer of certain rights associated with the property. There is no such transfer," I said, and set the black strongbox on the table. I opened it and laid out the documents the way a seamstress lays out pattern pieces will deed trust. Tax records filed in my name for 2 decades. Owner's objection filed and acknowledged. Mr. Dane adjusted his glasses with 2 fingers. He read. He read the way a man eats food that might contain bones carefully and with the occasional pause to reconsider his choices. When he reached the clause about presence, he drew a small square around it with his eyes. "Mrs. Cartwright is correct," he said at last, turning to his client. Sienna's mouth tightened into an idea she did not find flattering. She looked at Julian as if he were a mirror that had misrepresented her. "You told me," she began and then stopped because the accusation she preferred would have made her look smaller. "You allowed us to prepare an event," she said to me instead, "and then you closed the door." "I objected in writing before you staged a single chair," I said, sliding the stamped copy of Rowan's notice toward her. "It was your choice not to believe paper." She stood so quickly, her chair voiced its outrage against the tile. "This is humiliating." "This is accurate," I said. Julian did not stand. He stared at the will as if it were a map he had forgotten how to read. He looked tired in the manner of a man who has been handing out the wrong currency and cannot understand why the machines keep spitting it back. "I didn't know about the updates to the gate," he said, small, as if offering the world the only apology he could carry. "I thought you were on board." "You did not ask," I said. The sentence landed without a ripple and then continued on to sit somewhere private. I closed the strongbox and slid it back to the corner. "Would you like tea?" I asked, because the offer cost me nothing and reminded me who I was. He shook his head. Sienna did not answer. Mr. Dane indicated with a polite finger that he and his briefcase would remove themselves. They left. Silence practiced itself in the sunroom for a while after that. I listened to it the way you listen to a creek for the places where the water widens and the places where it narrows. A week later, they returned. This time, Sienna did not knock. she rapped. Mr. Dane carried a neat packet with tabs. Julian trailed by half a step, the position of a person who believes proximity can substitute for agreement. "We've drafted a solution," Mr. Dane said, sliding the packet onto the table. "A co-ownership agreement. Mrs. Cartwright retains life estate and full occupancy. Future rights vest in my clients for estate planning purposes. It resolves," he looked up, searching for a word that would not ignite tensions. "I did not touch the papers, no." "It's fair," Sienna said, selling a dress that would always pinch in the shoulders. "You get to stay. We get clarity. Everyone wins." "What you get," I said, "are consequences for choices you made in rooms that did not belong to you." She laughed once, a sharp little thing. "You can't keep this place forever." "I am keeping it for as long as the law and my breath agree," I said. "That is the only timeline that concerns me." Julian sat straighter. For a moment, the child in him raised his hand from inside the man and asked for permission to speak. "Maybe we could," he began. "No," I said gently, because there are answers a mother must give without weaving them into softness. "Not this." Mr. Dane gathered this paper slowly as if they might explode in his hands. Sienna stood tugged at the cuff of her sleeve and leaned forward the distance of a half-confession. "You'll regret this," she said, as if the future owed her a favor. I opened the door. "Good afternoon." They left again, the door closing behind them with the small definitive click of a catch finding its seat. After they were gone, I went to the kitchen. The pot of rosemary I kept on the sill had grown leggy. I pinched it back. Outside, the roses lifted their pale faces and did the job they have always done, which is to bloom whether or not anyone has earned it. I carried a bowl to the garden and cut 4 stems, 2 for the hall, 1 for the bedroom, 1 to lay on the stone where Graham's handprint still darkens when it rains. In the afternoon light, the house had edges again clear as a blueprint. I wiped the table, set the kettle on, and listened to the bare sound of the burner catching. The air through the screens smelled like mown grass and paper. The clock over the stove kept time without consulting anyone. I sat, poured, and let the cup warm my hands. The rooms held, the ground held. I did not move. The house learned a quieter register in the days that followed. Footsteps sounded truer on the oak. The stair returned to its old companionable creak. I mended a loose hem on the library curtains and oiled the hinges on the pantry door. Small repairs that felt like returning a violin to pitch. The first ripple came from a screen I rarely bothered with. A former catering assistant, young Frank, posted 3 photographs of lanterns and place settings with a plain sentence beneath. The groom's mother wasn't invited, though it was her home. There were no names. There didn't need to be. The post traveled on the kind of breeze people recognize when something ordinary has been arranged wrong. Messages found me the way rain finds a slope. A florist's daughter wrote, "You let me gather lilac stems when I was 7. I still have the ribbon." A mason whose crew repaired the porch after a winter storm sent a photograph of his son on graduation day standing under our maple. A woman I didn't know thanked me for lending chairs to a community concert 10 summers ago. None of it asked for reply. I sat at the kitchen table reading and felt the house recalibrate around the names. The letter from the young couple arrived 2 days later, hand-addressed in blue ink that thinned at the loops. "Dear Mrs. Cartwright," it began. "We're both teachers. We read about your garden and felt this is strange to say, like it had room for the promises we can afford. Would you allow a small ceremony by the trellis 6 people? 1 violin. We'll clean up every cup and leaf." They signed Mira and Eli and included a pressed sprig of thyme that left its clean breath on the paper. I wrote back with a date and nothing more and set about making the garden ready, the way one makes a guest room, fresh linen on the line, a bowl of lemons on the hall table. Mateo trimmed the roses as lightly as a barber who knows the head beneath the hair. On the morning they came, the weather stood politely at 72 degrees. Mira wore a dress the color of unbleached linen. Eli Ernest, in his 2 new shoes, carried the violin case because the violinist had broken a strap on the walk from the car. The vows were sentences people had used before and would use again, and they were perfect for that reason. When the bow drew across the strings, the smallest thing happened. A dragonfly threaded the air between us and sat on the trellis as if it too had business there. We drank lemonade on the steps and ate slices of a cake that Mira's friend had made at midnight. When they left, they took nothing but the thyme sprig pressed now in a different book. That evening I wrote a letter to my son. I did not practice it in my head. I let my hand find its route on the page. "Julian," I began, "I'm not writing to argue myself into your calendar. I'm writing because the door between us needs a latch, and I am the one standing close enough to install it. I loved you well, sometimes too quietly. I will not measure that here. I am setting a boundary because the house and I breathe better with it. If you need to reach me, you know how. If you choose not to, that is an answer too." I slid a photograph into the envelope, a square print from a summer afternoon, When he was 4, his face sunstruck and sticky with watermelon, his arm hooked around my neck like a sailor's knot. On the back I wrote, "This is still true somewhere." I stamped the envelope and walked it to the mailbox at the end of the lane, listening to gravel certify my steps. The next afternoon, a man stood by the picket fence with his hat in his hands. He had the calm posture of someone who has carried grief without letting it bend him out of shape. "Pardon," he said. "Are you Mrs. Cartwright? I'm Harrison Cole. My mother worked with your husband on the town library grant back when the roof leaked over the children's corner. She spoke of you both like fixtures in the place." I remembered Harrison's mother at once, a woman whose signature sloped like a field. "Come around," I said, opening the gate. We sat on the back porch with 2 cups of tea. He told me his wife had died the previous year, quietly, cleanly, in the way that still leaves sharp edges. He had a small parcel on the far side of Deerfield Ridge where he grew kitchen herbs and a mean row of zinnias. "There's space on the southern edge I can't bring myself to use," he said. "If you ever want cuttings for your roses, it would please me to have that ground busy with something that climbs instead of thinks." He said it like a man offering a chair when you didn't realize you were tired. I thanked him. We talked about the library, about the way towns keep their spines if you mind them. When he left, I walked the line of the hedge and checked the ties. The roses were holding. The online album for the wedding surfaced itself to me one evening, the way a house key you thought you'd lost turns up in the wrong dish. The gallery was all lit smiles and tidy hands, the photographer fond of foreground blur. I was not in a single frame, not even as a suggestion. I closed the tab and opened the drawer where I keep my own photographs, Graham at the kitchen table sketching a hinge, the first snow that stuck to the cedar posts, Julian at 9, his front tooth new and uncommitted, holding a carp he had no intention of cleaning. I laid 3 on the table. They held more of the house than any carousel of rented lanterns. Neighbors began to come by, not with pity tucked under their arms, but with cobblers and stories. Mrs. Hall from 2 doors down sent over a pan of peach squares that ruined dinner and improved the day. The college kid who mowed lawns one summer dropped off a note on lined paper. "You taught me how to coil an extension cord the right way." I found myself setting an extra glass on the porch table without intending to, and then filling it because someone had wandered up the drive with news of a new grandchild or a dog that had learned at last to heel. I hosted a small evening because the house asked for it. No occasion, no speeches. I lit 4 beeswax tapers and set out bowls of almonds and plums and crackers that forgot to be fancy. A few of my former colleagues from the design committee came, and the retired mail carrier who once brought the stack of winter seed catalogs straight to the kitchen door because he didn't want them to freeze in the box, and the young couple with the violin. We stood under the maple where Mateo had strung a modest run of lights. Laughter rose the way bread does when the air has the right warmth in it. Someone found the old photo album on the sideboard and opened it. There I was at 30, hair pinned up with a pencil, holding a baby in a yellow hat, as if gravity had let us off for the afternoon. I did not have to look away. The image could stand where it stood without scraping me raw. Julian came once at midday unannounced the week after the letter. He looked thinner around the mouth, a boy attempting someone else's jawline. He stood in the door and said, "The notice you sent was clear." It was the first time I had liked the word clear in his voice. He handed me a small padded envelope, a set of spare keys. I hadn't realized he'd duplicated and now understood he had. "I thought you might want these back," he said, and the sentence lifted a little at the end, as if asking permission to be a kind of apology. I nodded. He did not cross the threshold. We did not discuss the rest. When he turned to go, he touched the doorframe with 2 fingers, an old habit from childhood when he would count his world by doorways and the ridges on the banister. The gesture surprised us both. "Take care," he said. "You as well," I answered, and closed the door on the simplest conversation we had had in a year. Paper did the rest. Rowan filed the restatement of the trust and sent me back the stamped copies, the ink still a little bright. Vendors updated their lists. The planner's company sent a short note that managed to be professional and chastened at once. Mr. Dane inquired once more about future arrangements, and I returned an answer of 1 syllable that needed no footnote. The house did not change hands. It simply continued to be itself more exactly. A week later, I took cuttings from the roses and drove out to Deerfield Ridge with a spade. Harrison met me at the fence and led me along the row. We chose a patch with decent drainage and room to misjudge without catastrophe. The air smelled like damp cedar and tomato vine. I pressed each cutting into a patient earth and watered until the ground darkened into its thinking color. Harrison showed me where the sun would fall in October. I told him how to winter the canes with burlap if the season misbehaved. We didn't call it friendship. We didn't have to call it anything. When I came home, the afternoon had settled into the good part. I opened the windows. The screens breathed. I set a small table on the porch with a plate of sliced pears and the book I had been trying like a stubborn jar. A breeze ferried in the scent of rosemary from the kitchen pot I had pinched back too hard and then apologized to with water. Inside, the clock over the stove did what clocks do when no one quarrels with them. I walked through each room without purpose. The walnut bench kept its shadow under the maple. The trellis threw a lattice on the paving stones that looked like a graph, proving a point and then letting it go. In the reading room, the armchair still fit the bend of my back. I sat. I listened. The house and I kept company, neither of us requiring the other to be anything but present. When the last light slid along the floor and vanished into the baseboard, I rose, turned on the smallest lamp, and poured the rest of the tea. The rooms held, the ground held. I set my palm on the cool pane of the open window and felt the night arrive the way it always has, simply sufficiently without announcement. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.